They say college is where you discover yourself, but for me, it was where I found someone else, Elizabeth. I was the guy who always seemed to end up at the center of things. Frat parties, intramural sports, group study sessions. Elizabeth was the opposite. She had this quiet, almost bookish energy, the kind that made her seem like she belonged in another era. We first crossed paths in business ethics class, where Professor Walker had us do one of those dreaded semester-long group projects. The groups were assigned alphabetically, and fate, or maybe just our last names, put me and Elizabeth together. During our first meeting, I was doing what I usually did, cracking jokes and trying to charm everyone into letting me take the easy parts of the assignment. But Elizabeth wasn't laughing. She just sat there, her brown eyes fixed on her notebook, her pen moving with the precision of a surgeon. When I finally directed a question at her, she looked up like she wasn't sure I was actually speaking to her. "Oh," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I think we should start with the ethical frameworks. It's probably best to define those before we look at case studies." That was the first time I really noticed her. Noticed how her shyness wasn't from insecurity but from a deep, almost methodical way of thinking. She didn't waste words. Over the next few weeks, I found myself looking forward to our project meetings more than I should have. Sure, I'd throw in a joke here and there to lighten the mood, but mostly I listened. Elizabeth was full of insights I hadn't expected, and there was something captivating about the way her cheeks flushed pink every time she realized the group was focusing on her. By the end of the semester, the project had been a success, and so had my not-so-subtle attempts to get closer to her. I asked her out the day after we turned in our final paper. "It's, just coffee," I stammered, more nervous than I'd been since my freshman year. She stared at me for a long second before nodding, her lips curling into the smallest, shyest smile I'd ever seen. One coffee turned into dinner dates, late-night study sessions, and eventually weekends spent exploring the little bookstores and art galleries she loved. By the time we graduated, we were inseparable. Elizabeth wasn't like anyone I'd met before. She didn't need the spotlight. She was the calm in the middle of the storm that was my life. Our engagement was as understated as Elizabeth herself. While my parents had envisioned some grand affair at the country club, she insisted on something simple, a dinner at her parents' estate with just close relatives. That night, when I slipped the ring onto her finger, her eyes shimmered with tears. She tried to blink away. Even on our wedding day, Elizabeth's shyness showed. She blushed a deep crimson during the vows, her hands trembling slightly as she slipped the ring on my finger. But when she looked at me, there was nothing shy about the love in her eyes. Life after college felt like a dream. Elizabeth joined her family's luxury real estate firm, content to work behind the scenes, while I managed one of my family's investment portfolios. We were building a life together, or so I thought. But looking back, maybe I mistook her quiet nature for contentment. Maybe I didn't see the things I should have. Our early years of marriage felt like a continuation of the dream we started in college. We bought a beautiful colonial-style house in the suburbs, complete with a wraparound porch and a yard that begged for summer barbecues. Elizabeth threw herself into decorating, and true to her style, the house reflected her quiet elegance. Simple, classic, and perfect in every way. Elizabeth's career flourished at her family's luxury real estate firm. She worked long hours, often spending her evenings finalizing deals or soothing high-strung clients who demanded her expertise. I'd tease her sometimes, calling her the real estate whisperer, and she'd smile that small, self-conscious smile I loved so much. My days were just as busy. Managing my family's investment portfolios meant meetings, deadlines, and the occasional trip out of state. Even so, we always found time for each other. Fridays were our special nights, reserved for unwinding together. Sometimes we'd go to a cozy Italian restaurant downtown, and other times we'd stay in, sharing takeout on the couch while watching Elizabeth's favorite old movies. From the outside, our life looked almost picture-perfect. My parents adored Elizabeth, charmed by her quiet grace and thoughtfulness. Her parents seemed equally smitten with me, often inviting us over for Sunday brunches filled with laughter and stories. Friends would joke about how ideal we were as a couple, and honestly, it wasn't far from the truth. As the years passed, talk of expanding our family naturally came up. I'd always imagined having kids, a couple of little ones running around the yard, a golden retriever following close behind. Elizabeth, ever the thoughtful planner, wanted to wait. "Let's make sure everything is settled first," she'd say, her voice steady and practical. And it made sense. We were still young, and her career was in a demanding phase. She wanted to be certain we had the stability and the time to give a child the best possible start. I admired that about her, how carefully she thought through everything, how committed she was to doing things the right way. "Someday," she'd say with a soft smile, her hand brushing against mine. "And when that day comes, it'll be perfect." I couldn't argue with that. We had all the time in the world, and for now, life was good. Weekends at the lake house, quiet evenings at home, and the occasional getaway to somewhere warm and sunny. Every moment felt like a building block in the life we were creating together. Looking back, those years were some of the happiest of my life. A few years into our marriage, life shifted in ways neither of us had expected. My father decided to step back from managing the family's investments, handing me a larger share of the responsibility. The added workload was daunting at first, but Elizabeth was my biggest cheerleader, always ready with words of encouragement when I came home exhausted. Elizabeth's career was booming as well. She had a knack for understanding clients' unspoken needs, and word spread quickly in the elite circles her firm catered to. She became the go-to person for high-stakes deals, landing contracts that made her one of the firm's top performers. I was so proud of her that I didn't even mind the late nights or weekend calls she often had to field. During this time, we made a decision that felt like the natural next step. We adopted a dog, a golden retriever puppy we named Bailey. Bailey was the perfect addition to our little family, bringing endless energy and plenty of laughter into our lives. Watching Elizabeth with him warmed my heart in ways I couldn't put into words. As we settled into this new phase, conversations about starting a family became more frequent. One night, after a particularly grueling week at work, I brought it up again. "Liz, have you thought more about it? About, trying for a baby?" She looked up from the book she was reading, her face thoughtful. "I have," she said slowly, setting the book aside. "And I think maybe soon. Things are finally calming down at work, and I want to make sure I'm ready to give it my all." It wasn't a definitive yes, but it was the closest she'd come to agreeing. I decided not to press the issue, feeling hopeful for the first time in a while. Around this time, Elizabeth started spending more weekends at her parents' estate, helping her mother organize some major renovations. I didn't mind. Our families had always been close, and she seemed genuinely excited about the project. I'd join her occasionally, but most weekends I stayed back, catching up on work or spending time with Bailey. Life felt full, almost too full, but in a good way. There was no reason to think anything was amiss. If there were signs, I didn't see them. Or maybe I just didn't want it. It was around this time that I started noticing small shifts in Elizabeth's behavior. At first, they were easy to brush off. She'd always been meticulous, but now her phone seemed glued to her hand. When I asked about it, she laughed and said her clients were more demanding than ever. Her weekend trips to her parents' estate also became more frequent. "Mom needs me to help oversee the contractors," she'd explain with a shrug. It made sense. Elizabeth's eye for detail was unmatched, and her mother trusted her judgment completely. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was spending more time there than necessary. One Sunday evening, she came home later than usual, her hair damp from the shower she'd taken before driving back. Bailey greeted her with his usual excitement, but instead of her typical warm response, she seemed distracted. When I asked how the renovations were going, her answer was vague, something about the kitchen backsplash being delayed. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Of course," she said, flashing a smile. "Just a lot on my plate right now." I let it go, chalking it up to stress. We were both busy, after all, and I didn't want to be the guy who turned minor things into major issues. But the small changes kept adding up. She started spending more time on her appearance, even for simple errands. Her perfume, one I'd picked out for her anniversary, seemed to linger in the air more often. And then there were the calls she'd excuse herself to take in another room. It wasn't like her to be secretive, but whenever I asked about it, she'd laugh it off. "You're imagining things," she'd say, her voice light and reassuring. The thing is, I wanted to believe her. We'd built a life together, a good one. If there was anything to worry about, she'd tell me, wouldn't she? One night, after she'd gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through her social media. I wasn't proud of it, but something was gnawing at me. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary, photos of us, Bailey, and the occasional work-related post. Still, the unease lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Elizabeth had never given me a reason not to trust her. Whatever was going on, it was probably nothing. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. By spring, the pace of our lives had hit overdrive. Elizabeth was spending nearly every weekend at her parents' estate, and work demands on my end were relentless. It felt like we were two trains running parallel but never quite meeting, each moving forward at breakneck speed. One Friday, over dinner, I brought up the idea of taking a break. What if we went away for a long weekend? I suggested, spearing a piece of salmon with my fork. Just you and me. We could go to the cabin in Vermont. Bailey would love it too. Elizabeth smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. That sounds wonderful, she said, pushing her salad around on her plate. Maybe next month? Things at work are crazy right now, and Mom's still leaning on me for the renovation project. Sure, I said, masking my disappointment. Next month. The following week, something happened that shifted my perspective. Elizabeth was out running errands, and Bailey had knocked my phone off the coffee table in one of his bursts of enthusiasm. When I picked it up, I noticed it had landed next to Elizabeth's phone. It lit up as I reached for mine, revealing a notification from someone named D. It was a text, simple and unassuming. Thinking of you. Hope I get to see you soon. My stomach churned. I knew better than to jump to conclusions, but my mind raced anyway. D could have been anyone, a friend, a coworker, even a family member. But the message felt personal, too personal. When Elizabeth came home, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about that text. She seemed relaxed, even cheerful, as she greeted Bailey and set down the groceries. Hey, she said, brushing past me with a kiss on the cheek. I picked up that coffee you like. Thanks, I said, forcing a smile. Busy day? Same as always, she replied, unpacking bags. Her phone buzzed on the counter, but she didn't even glance at it. I did, though, and saw another notification from D flash across the screen before it disappeared. I didn't ask about it. Not then. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that confronting her without context would only make things worse. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was imagining things. Elizabeth had never given me a reason not to trust her, but for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure I had all the pieces to the puzzle. The text messages from D haunted me for weeks. I tried to ignore them, to bury the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. Elizabeth wasn't acting suspicious, at least not in any overt way. She went about her days as usual, busy, composed, and kind. But once the thought that something might be wrong crept in, I couldn't unthink it. One evening, a conversation with my younger sister, Claire, sent everything into a tailspin. She had stopped by for dinner and brought along a DNA test kit she'd purchased. I got one of these for fun, Claire said, waving the box as she sat at the kitchen table. I thought it'd be cool to learn more about our ancestry. Want one? They were running a sale, so I grabbed an extra. Elizabeth smiled, pouring Claire a glass of wine. That sounds fascinating, she said. I've always wanted to know more about where my mom's side comes from. We're supposed to have Scottish roots, but no one's ever confirmed it. Here, take it, Claire said, sliding the box across the table. It's easy, just spit in the tube and mail it in. I laughed, picking up the kit. Why not? I've got nothing to hide. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before laughing too, her voice just a little too high-pitched. I'll have to think about it. I'm not great with this kind of stuff. That small hesitation caught my attention, though I didn't press her on it. Over the next few days, I thought about the test more than I should have. I wasn't particularly interested in my ancestry. I already knew most of it. but a part of me wondered if Elizabeth's reluctance to take it had less to do with squeamishness and more to do with something else. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to mail mine in. It felt harmless at the time, like a casual experiment to satisfy Claire's enthusiasm. Weeks passed, and I nearly forgot about it, until the results arrived. I opened the email late one night while Elizabeth was upstairs getting ready for bed. The information was standard at first: percentages of European ancestry, regions linked to distant relatives, and a list of DNA matches. I scrolled through it absent-mindedly, expecting nothing of note. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize, one that wasn't on my radar at all. Under immediate family, there was a match I hadn't anticipated: a child. My breath caught as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. Elizabeth and I didn't have children. And yet, there it was. The name listed below mine. A match strong enough to suggest a close biological connection. I sat there, frozen, as 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Who was this child? How could this be possible? And, most importantly, what did Elizabeth know that I didn't? I couldn't stop staring at the screen. A child. My DNA matched with a child. Their name was listed as LM, and the site estimated the age to be somewhere around 5 or 6 years old. I quickly clicked on the profile, but there wasn't much more information, just a generic placeholder photo and the option to reach out. My heart pounded as I reread the results, hoping I'd missed something, some explanation that made sense. But there wasn't one. Elizabeth came downstairs a few minutes later, her hair damp from the shower and a towel draped over her shoulders. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "You're still up?" I closed my laptop quickly, my mind scrambling for what to say. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound normal. "Just catching up on some emails." She leaned down to kiss me on the cheek, and I caught a whiff of her lavender shampoo. The familiarity of the moment made my stomach churn. Did she know? Was she hiding something? Or was this all some kind of mistake? For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. Work meetings blurred together, and I barely touched my food at dinner. Elizabeth noticed, of course. She wasn't the type to let things slide. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been distant." "I'm fine," I said too quickly, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind. It wasn't a complete lie. The DNA results consumed my thoughts, but I couldn't bring myself to confront Elizabeth. What if I was wrong? What if there was a logical explanation? Instead, I decided to dig deeper. I contacted the DNA company, requesting more information about the match. They were cagey at first, citing privacy concerns, but after some back and forth, they confirmed the basics. The match was accurate, and the child's guardian had consented to their information being included in the database. Guardian, not parent. That word stuck with me. I stared at the name on the screen again. LM. Who were they? How were we connected? And why did the idea of confronting Elizabeth feel so terrifying? The answer came sooner than I expected. One evening, while Elizabeth was out at a late client meeting, I decided to reach out through the DNA site's messaging system. My message was simple. "Hi, I noticed we're a close DNA match. I'm trying to understand how we might be related. If you're open to talking, I'd really appreciate it." I hit send and immediately felt a pang of guilt. Reaching out like this felt invasive, but I didn't know what else to do. The response came less than an hour later. "Hello. Thank you for reaching out. I think I know who you are, and I think it's time we talked." My pulse raced as I read the message again. Whoever was on the other side of that profile knew me, and they weren't surprised to hear from me. I typed out a reply, my hands trembling. "Who am I to you? Please, I need to understand." The next message was short. Too short. "Liam is your son." The words hung on the screen like a neon sign I couldn't look away from. Liam is your son. My son? It didn't make sense. Elizabeth and I didn't have kids. We talked about it, dreamed about it, but we'd never actually taken the leap. And yet, here it was, in black and white. I sat frozen, my mind racing through every possibility. Could it be a mistake? Some kind of clerical error or database glitch? But the DNA test wasn't the kind of thing that left much room for error. Before I could stop myself, I fired off another message. "There must be some mistake. I don't have a son. Who is Liam's mother? The response came quicker than I expected. You should talk to your wife. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. This couldn't be real. Elizabeth couldn't hide something like this from me. She wasn't capable of that kind of deception, was she? The front door opened, and I scrambled to close the laptop. Elizabeth walked in, her cheeks flushed from the cold night air. Hey, she said, setting her bag down on the counter. Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran longer than I expected. No problem, I said, my voice strained. She paused, looking at me more closely. You sure you're okay? You look pale. I'm fine, I replied, forcing a smile. Just tired. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more information. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I reopened the laptop and began searching for answers. I combed through the DNA site, scouring the profiles of matches, but there was nothing else to connect Liam to me, or to Elizabeth. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I took the afternoon off work and drove to her parents' estate. Maybe her mother or father would know something, or maybe they'd accidentally let something slip. But when I arrived, the house was quiet. Her mother greeted me with her usual warmth, offering tea and cookies. We made small talk about the renovations before I worked up the courage to ask. So, has Elizabeth mentioned anything about a child named Liam? Her mother's hand froze mid-reach for her teacup. For a moment, her face betrayed something. A flicker of recognition, quickly masked. Why do you ask that? She said, her voice careful. I just came across the name recently. Something to do with a DNA test I took. The results were confusing. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. I think that's a conversation you need to have with Elizabeth. The room felt suffocating. Her non-answer was an answer in itself. I left the estate with more questions than I'd arrived with. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Elizabeth was sitting on the couch, her feet tucked under her, reading a book. She looked up and smiled when I walked in. Hey, she said softly. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding. Liz, we need to talk. Elizabeth looked up from her book, her expression shifting as she noticed the tension in my voice. She set the book aside and stood, her hands clasped in front of her. What's going on? She asked, her brow furrowing. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Liz, I started, my voice shaking. I need you to be honest with me. Is there something you haven't told me? Something about a child? Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her face draining of color. Why would you ask me that? She whispered. Because I took a DNA test, I said, my voice growing firmer, and it matched me to a son, a child I didn't even know existed. His name is Liam. Liz, please, tell me what's going on. Elizabeth took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the couch for support. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me, her lips trembling. I didn't want you to find out this way, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Find out what? I demanded, my frustration boiling over. That I have a son? That you kept this from me? How could you not tell me something like this? She wiped at her eyes, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. It's not what you think, she said, her voice cracking. Then explain it to me, I said, my voice breaking. Because right now, I don't know what to think. Elizabeth sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. Liam is your son, she said finally, her words barely above a whisper. But he's not mine. The room seemed to tilt as her words sank in. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice hoarse. How could I have a son who isn't yours? She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Before we got married, she began, her voice trembling, you had a brief relationship with someone else. Her name was Dana. Dana? I repeated, the name unfamiliar. She reached out to me a few months after we got engaged, Elizabeth continued. She said she was pregnant and that you were the father, but she didn't want to disrupt your life. She wanted to raise the baby on her own. My legs felt like they might give out. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Elizabeth sobbed, shaking her head. Because I was scared, she admitted. I was scared it would change everything. She promised she wouldn't ask for anything, and I thought it was better if you didn't know. I stared at her, my mind racing. A son. All these years, I had a son, and she kept it from me. She lied, I said finally, my voice cold. She put him in the DNA database. She wanted me to find out. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I turned away, my thoughts a storm of anger, confusion, and grief. How had my life turned into this? The weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations and tentative steps toward healing. Elizabeth worked tirelessly to regain my trust, showing up for every visit with Liam and finding ways to help me reconnect with the son I hadn't known existed. She listened without defensiveness, apologized without excuses, and reminded me, in her quiet way, of the woman I'd fallen in love with. One evening, as we sat together on the couch after a long day, I finally broke the silence that had lingered between us for weeks. Liz, I said, my voice soft but steady, I've been angry, hurt, and I can't pretend that what you did didn't change things between us. But I also can't pretend that I don't still love you. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned to face me. I'm so sorry, she whispered, for all of it, for not trusting you enough to tell you the truth, for taking away your choice. I'll regret it forever. I reached for her hand, holding it tightly. I've been thinking a lot about Liam, about what kind of father I want to be for him. And I realized that if I can show him anything, it should be the importance of forgiveness. You made a mistake, a big one, but I know it came from a place of love. I want us to move forward, together. Elizabeth broke into a sob, burying her face in her hands. I pulled her close, feeling the weight of months of tension lift as she melted into my arms. I'll make it up to you, she said through her tears. I promise. We'll make it up to each other, I replied, my voice resolute. The road to healing wasn't easy, but over time, we found our way back to each other. Liam became the heart of our growing family, and Elizabeth and I rebuilt our marriage with honesty and understanding. Some wounds leave scars, but scars are proof of healing, and of a love strong enough to endure even the most painful truths.
Thank you for listening to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and like us.